Professor Laird here. I hope everybody is staying safe.
This is Chapter 7 in the Political Ideologies course. Chapter 7 is on fascism, and we will be looking at this in two different sections. Today we'll be looking at Part 1 of fascism. So let's back up and talk a little bit about totalitarianism, and that is defined as the complete control of social, cultural, economic institutions. We've talked a little bit about Stalin and his version of Marxist socialism and how it turned into a totalitarian system. We'll be talking in the second part of this lecture about Mussolini and Hitler's introduction of fascism, to where we're looking at putting the masses together to blindly follow leaders to some perception of glory. And as we'll see, fascism developed as somewhat of a reaction against liberalism and socialism, concepts that we've already talked quite a bit about. And so rather than focusing on individuals or social classes, fascism is absorbing all of these into what we might call an all-embracing whole of society. Now, the background of fascism is, again, questioning this concept of reason, which was so important in the Enlightenment, and that reason is less reliable than intuition and emotion. And so, therefore, the leaders that are going to capitalize on this concept will use that to their benefit to keep people together in a fascist system. Now, fascism, of course, was hostile to religion and to hereditary monarchs. What they were trying to do then was to concentrate power in the hands of the totalitarian state. We'll see that there is somewhat of a preoccupation with nationalism here as we start talking more about fascism. But let's go back a little bit further and talk about how the roots of fascism are in this concept of counter-enlightenment or opposition to the Enlightenment period that we've hit on quite a bit so far, that period in the 17th and 18th centuries where we were looking at use of individual reason, scientific inquiry. Now, the primary premises of the Enlightenment, we've got several isms here that we really haven't talked about specifically. We just talked about in generally how the Enlightenment is looking at reason, scientific inquiry. But the concept of humanism is that humans are the source and value of life, which puts it back into the individual's realm. Rationalism, now we're talking about in the sense that we're using rational choice, rational behavior, rational methods in order to let reason and scientific inquiry to solve problems. That's not necessarily the same as rationalization, which we may have talked about before, where people might rationalize what they're doing. Rationalism is just the overarching concept of using a rational choice, in this case, reason and scientific inquiry. Secularism, in that religion is not the absolute unquestionable truth. There's lots of ideas out there, and the Western democratic society started to accept this concept of secularism, even though religion's still very strong in the societies, but enabled to coexist with secularism. Progressivism, where we're trying to use knowledge, reason, learning, education to try to remove the shackles of ignorance and superstition to make society more educated, that would then create more people that could contribute and create progress. And then universalism is the idea that humans have the same essential nature. We've talked about human universals a little bit already, and that all humans came from the same common ancestors, the Homo sapiens that we are today. So that all started to bring up the idea that all humans' brains are essentially the same thing. And so there's a lot more common ground than we may realize, despite the fact that we've been separated in these different cultures for so many thousands of years. Now, the Enlightenment, of course, inspired both liberalism and socialism, which we've talked quite a bit about. Liberalism, of course, being the foundation of Western democratic societies, and socialism still being somewhat of an influence on social democratic systems that are trying to soften the edges of capitalism in order to try to get more people plugged into the economy, less inequality, things like that. So the counter-enlightenment started to come about within the century after the Enlightenment had made so much of its mark and influenced so many people, such as the Immanuel Kant and the David Humes and the Adam Smiths and the Alexander Hamiltons that we've been talking about. But the attackers of the Enlightenment aren't quite as well known. Perhaps Marquis de Sade, one of the more well known, that was into doing his own thing, quite literally. So some of the things that were being questioned was this concept of universalism. Is that a myth? So the counter Enlightenment movement would say yes, that what is more important is that our differences, the idea that these differences between us are the most important thing and that they're permanent. Our languages, our cultures, our race, our gender, those are permanent differences that is really what defines what human societies are about. We could also say that the belief in heaven and hell keeps people behaving rather than reason. So that's where someone who might wants to use a fascist type system can use that to their benefit as they may see fit in order to try to keep people under their control into one big mass of society rather than each individual using their own reason. Even though humans may not be rational creatures all the time, we've got lots of research that shows how human beings do not always use rational choice. But from the counter-enlightenment view is that we're saying that humans are fundamentally irrational and fundamentally conflictual, which is not necessarily true. Yes, we perhaps have an aggressive instinct, but we also have a cooperative instinct, and we also, when so inclined, and we have motives to do it, we will use rational choice. So it's a mixed bag, but of course the forerunners of counter-enlightenment were saying that there's really no rational behavior, that we're fundamentally irrational. And of course, the nationalism is also fused into this as well. And the modern concept of nationalism really started to come around in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon, in his attempt to be the emperor of Europe, once that was defeated, Western European states started to coalesce back to their own sense of nationhood, particularly the sense of German nationality at that time, and that more and more ideas were coming out that the meaning of life is connected to the nation that you have been raised in and the community, the lasting community that the nation brings, and that each nation brings something unique to the world. So these are relatively positive ways of looking at a nation that then may eventually inspired other concepts of nationalism. And with Otto von Bismarck, in Germany, he started to make some major reforms into what we might call the modern state as we get into the 20th century that politically embodied the concept of the nation state or nationalism. And we also see that Italy was very much at the center of commerce and the cultural revolutions during the Renaissance and became identified with that. And in the 1800s, there was efforts to unify states, and this became the ideal deal for all nations, and that some of the philosophy was that this is what God intended through geography. If we were separated into these geographic regions, well, then there's a reason for that. If we were separated by mountains, rivers, seas, then that was the intent for us to have our separate nations and therefore our separate cultures as well. Now, there were some original ideas out there. Philosophers such as Mazzini was talking about how nation states would live their own cultures but live in harmony with others. And then also that was a nationalism that did inspire Zionism, which was the movement for the Jews establishing homeland in Israel. The Jews were quite persecuted up into the 20th century and actually had started purchasing land and then established a state there in the Middle East. And that was inspired by the desire for Jews to have their own nation state. Now, the concept of elitism, which is thrown out in today's world quite a bit, particularly if there's more distrust of government or the educated society, then there may be some feelings that the rich or the upper educated are conspiring to keep things to their liking. And so that might be some of the theories of elitism out there. But early on, the elitism started to form that with respect to representative democracy, we've always had this notion that of the tyranny of the majority, and this is why the Constitution was, of course, written in order to provide a representative democracy because of the fear of mob rule and the tyranny of the majority and that sort of thing, and that the social democracy promotes a classless society. But what we see is that the elite theorists, such as Pareto and Mosca, were starting to conclude that it may not be possible to have a completely classless or completely equal society. There is evidence of this. We see that in any social system, there tends to be a relatively small group of leaders that inevitably evolve. This has been also called the iron law of oligarchy, where power tends to concentrate in the hands of a small group. And this, of course, is the nature of large organizations, that we see this even today, that corporations that come up with an idea and do it well and become successful at it, they are very dominant in the economy. So there clearly is a tendency for oligarchic systems to form in any human society. We've also talked about the power rule that was that Pareto was also prominent in describing, in that a relatively small portion of society is going to have a relatively large portion of the power in any type of situation. And then Nietzsche, philosopher, who was famous for the God is dead quote and nihilism, where there's really not a belief in anything. But Nietzsche was talking about how a Superman, a very accomplished individual, would be at the heart of a lot of improvements in society, and that elitism should be the rule. Now, again, we're not talking about good, bad, right, or wrong, or looking at any system with judgment here, because even in today's world, the people that are educated or the people that are at the realm of power, well, then yes, they do tend to gravitate to positions of responsibility and power. And, some people might consider that a form of elitism. But what we're going to be talking about here, as far as a background, is that these types of concepts are taken to the extreme to get to a fascist society where a small handful of people who are in an opportune position or opportunity to exploit the society, then they take this position and literally put themselves into the position of being this Superman and controlling everyone else. So let's talk a little bit about irrationalism and how that is something that is fairly well studied today, particularly in behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, cognitive psychology, in that human beings generally aren't inclined to making rational calculations. But we've got quite a bit of research that we can go back to kind of, that is particularly as we get into the 20th century, we start to see that human beings are not necessarily rational. And Freud was talking about our unconscious instinctive drives. I mentioned those a little bit already. We have an aggressive instinct, an erotic instinct that helps to explain why the sexual drive, libido, might be even more important, particularly to men, than other particular drives or motives. William James did quite a bit of psychology of beliefs in religion and was talking about how humans are kind of geared to believe in something, perhaps anything. That's what kind of makes us human, is that we have to have something that drives us. What's the purpose in life? What do we believe in? Simon Le Bon was very influential in his work on the crowd, as when groups of people get together, they have a tendency to devolve to lowest common denominators, lowest common impulses, or potentially even a herd instinct. Now, we have talked a little bit about how if a society is more educated, yes, then you have more heads thinking. More heads are better than one if you got a lot of people thinking to solve problems, but this is not quite the same as the crowd when people get together. And this can happen on social media as well, is that conspiracy theories and misinformation can potentially gather and grow with under this herd instinct. And so we see a lot of evidence of this even in today. Pareto, we were talked about with some of his findings, and he was talking about how the human sentiments appear to be more important than material or economic factors. So this goes into trying to explain how humans are driven by their emotions and their beliefs, that sort of thing. Moscow was looking at how people are moved by slogans and symbols and flags and anthems. So therefore, this could potentially be used to drive people to act because they are rallying around a symbol or some sort of theme, and because humans are somewhat susceptible to that. And then Sorrell also talks about how people are moved by political myths, and this is how we might get recruited into being loyal to political ideologies, and that how a general strike could potentially be inspired. So what we've done here in this first section on our chapter on fascism is kind of set the stage, what was going on, particularly with the counter-enlightenment thinking, some of these ideas on on irrational behavior, which is, you could certainly argue that humans are driven. And we've talked about this before with our System 1 and our System 2 thinking, how humans are typically driven by their emotions and their beliefs and the perceptions of what they think of how things should be. And it takes conscious effort to go to that next level of System 2 thinking. So there's a lot of research that indicates that that's generally how we are as humans. But this is setting the stage for how a leader who understands that, but yet wants to use that to create his own idea of a powerful society by controlling the masses, then that's where these things can be taken to the next level. We've also talked a little bit about the social Darwinism. Though that was a fairly innocent idea that came out as we were talking about that divide between the welfare liberalists and the, I guess you could say, the more individual liberalists, where social Darwinists were talking about how it was kind of meant for us to not necessarily help the weak so that the strong could survive. May have started out as somewhat of an innocent type of theory, but then that could be taken to the next level. So what we're going to be talking about in the next section of this chapter is how Mussolini and Hitler in particular used these ideas to create their empires by appealing to people's emotions, by appealing to their instincts. So what I'm going to want you to do is, as part of this, we want to read in the reader that has been part of our course curriculum here in your, what we call our Ideals and Ideologies, The Reader by Ball and Dagger and O'Neill. Read The Doctrine of Fascism by Mussolini. That's on page 306. And that gives you some fairly well laid out steps as to what the fundamental ideas of fascism are, because Mussolini is credited with starting this that takes it to the next level. So then what we want to do is read a section from Mein Kampf, which was Hitler's book that he wrote while he was in prison, that kind of outlines his racist ideas and of putting in the master cultural race type concepts to create his idea of the Third Reich. So read those and then may assign some readings on that. But either way, stay tuned for a discussion forum that you'll want to respond to so that you can get counted as attending this particular lecture. So we will continue with the next video lecture for part 2 of fascism.